Hi everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join my ACSME 2021 presentation, where I'll be sharing my approach to blended laboratory delivery in a second year analytical chemistry unit at Curtin. Chem 2005 is a second semester core unit primarily for students enrolled in the Bachelor of Science or Bachelor of Advanced Science majoring in chemistry. However, it's also taken by students enrolled in double degrees, particularly chemistry, chemical engineering, secondary education majoring in chemistry, and more recently, students in nutrition or food science needing a grounding in analytical techniques. As you might expect, a major focus of this unit is the practical laboratory component, which makes up 35% of the total assessment. Of the unit's 5 learning outcomes, 3 specifically relate to the lab program, and the most significant of these for this context is the expectation that students will demonstrate a mastery of analytical chemistry laboratory skills. The lab program consists of 6 experiments, some running over multiple weeks, making up the majority of direct contact hours. In the first 3 experiments, students use predominantly wet chemistry techniques for sample preparation and quantitative analysis. This includes redox displacement, acid digestion, and titrations. The second and third experiments also begin introducing students to some analytical instrumentation. The last 3 experiments revolve around instrumental methods for quantitative and qualitative analysis, with students also exploring the parameters that affect sensitivity, accuracy, and precision of analytical measurements. These labs operate as a round robin, with students allocated to small groups so that they can each gain some individual experience using the instruments. The assessment in this unit was modified in 2020 so that the wet laboratories would be assessed through written reports, while instrumental laboratories would be assessed in class against a set of defined competencies. And this was a change that had been planned before COVID-19. For each experiment, students would also normally complete a written pre-laboratory assessment consisting of some theory questions and a risk assessment. This pre-lab submission made up 20% of the mark for each experiment. In 2020, however, COVID-19 meant significant changes had to be made to delivery. Although we were fortunate enough to avoid extended shutdowns in Perth, social distancing requirements halved our lab capacity, meaning we could only run limited face-to-face experiments. The big question was how to make sure students could demonstrate a mastery of analytical chemistry laboratory skills when they could only spend half of the usual time in the laboratory. We were also constrained by limited time, resources, and the mental fatigue on students and staff after having already experienced a semester of mostly online delivery. We wanted to create the most streamlined system possible that would still achieve the end goal, with the focus being on good, not necessarily perfect. With this in mind, the solution we implemented was to transition the first 3 experiments to online, what we refer to as take-home exercises. These were experiments that largely involved methods students were already familiar with from first year, and because they were assessed through written reports, they didn't strictly require in-lab practice. In fact, we would routinely have students who had missed one of these experiments complete the assessment using sample data. To make this a routine approach though, we knew we'd need to provide students with more specific support. The instrumental experiments would then run on campus as normal, except that group sizes were reduced for social distancing. These experiments were considered most strategic as they introduced students to instrumental methods commonly used in professional settings, along with more advanced data analysis skills. They'd be expected to be proficient in these skills as graduate chemists, but really needed direct experience to develop them. With the loss of other face-to-face classes, we also wanted to prioritize experiments where students could actively collaborate and where they'd be evaluated across the broadest range of skills possible. Each online take-home experiment was effectively a digital package containing a filmed recording of the experiment, extra support resources such as snapshot videos or useful web links to provide guidance in the absence of direct interaction with the lab demonstrator, and a streamlined assessment format that would let them demonstrate knowledge we'd normally look for in the laboratory. This approach was designed to give the most equivalent learning experience possible, with minimal development time and cost. Here's an example of one of our online lab packages set up in Blackboard. Each started with information about the purpose of the experiment, along with optional review resources to help students refresh their knowledge of the relevant first-year chemistry. This included both theory aspects, like how to calculate uncertainties, as well as practical skills like how to weigh samples by difference. I then created short films of each experiment with explanatory captions that students could view directly in Blackboard, helping them to visualize the procedure. These videos also highlighted key safety hazards and protocols, essentially the briefing information that they would normally be provided before starting the experiment if it were held on campus. Students were then provided with randomized sample data for each experiment that they would use to complete their reports. And rather than requiring a separate pre-lab assessment, we integrated this content into the report by requiring short sections discussing the theory of the experiment and the associated safety hazards. This minimized the number of submission points during what was already a challenging semester for our students. The on-campus instrumental labs instead put the focus on students' practice in the laboratory. Each experiment had a defined set of competencies covering chemical knowledge, practical skills, and employability attributes such as working safely and working in teams. These criteria and their marking rubrics were provided to students beforehand so that they knew what to expect. The major focus for marking these experiments was on practical skills. The lab team put together instructional videos that students could view in advance and provided in-lab demonstrations before students started the experiment. This meant that students could see the practical skills modeled before making their own attempt. They would then be provided with immediate feedback and another attempt if needed until they could display the skills successfully. The mark for each practical competency was based on how much assistance was required for them to do this, as the assumption was that no student should leave the laboratory without eventually demonstrating the skill. Students also had worksheets with some questions requiring them to analyze or interpret their data, forming the basis of their chemical knowledge competencies, while employability attributes were evaluated across the experiment based on how they interacted with other students and the demonstrators during the session, but again based on pre-specified criteria. Under the circumstances of 2020, we weren't able to formally evaluate the blended learning approach specifically. However, student responses in overall evaluation surveys were positive towards both the online and on-campus laboratories. We also saw above-average student satisfaction in relation to learning experiences, learning resources, and motivation, which was a fantastic outcome given the challenges of that year. In terms of actual student performance, the marks for the 3 initial experiments were on par with the previous year, within 5% on average. Marks were slightly higher for the instrumental experiments, but this was put down to the new assessment format that recognized students' achievements across a broader range of skills. Overall then, we were successful in helping students to achieve the intended outcomes through a blended learning approach. Part of this is no doubt due to the focus we placed on communication in the unit. We had dedicated workshops to outlining the approach we would take in delivering the laboratories and why, along with weekly updates so that students knew exactly what would be happening when. And this was an aspect that students specifically commented on in their evaluation surveys. We also didn't use particularly advanced technology in this approach. Field experiments were all recorded using an iPhone, and while I edited recordings in Camtasia, The demonstrator team made use of iMovie or Adobe Spark, which are more readily available. We made use of existing support resources where possible, and used our normal platforms such as Piazza for holding discussions. This put the focus on the content rather than learning new systems. Although students understood why we were running online labs, it was clear that they valued hands-on experience and wanted to see a return to fully face-to-face practicals. Based on this feedback, we're now exploring alternative ways of using online materials to supplement face-to-face learning. This year, we replaced written pre-lab questions and risk assessments with online induction modules that I constructed using Articulate Rise 360. This platform allows the construction of interactive modules embedded within our learning management system and then accessible using any online device. Each module outlines the experimental procedure using the recordings that we developed in 2020, but this time with the intent of preparing students to complete the experiments themselves. Students then progress through a series of sections that describe the safety hazards, along with the appropriate safety precautions. At the end of the module, they must pass a safety quiz based on the module content to be admitted into the lab, and they have many attempts as they need to do this. We recently polled the students on whether they preferred the online or traditional versions of pre-laboratory preparation, and of the third of the enrolled students who responded, almost all of them preferred the online format. I'd like to finish by acknowledging my teaching team, including the academic teaching staff, laboratory instructors and technical staff who helped to implement these approaches. Thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions in the discussion session.